Welcome back to the Fearless Project podcast. I'm your host, Dominique Hoffman, and today I'm coming to you with some great developments for our university campuses and for political life here in the United States. This past Monday, January 20th, President Donald J. Trump was sworn in as the 47th President of the United States. And immediately upon being sworn in, he made a beautiful speech in which he recognized the hostages and their return to Israel. And the same day, he signed a series of executive orders, one of which allows for the deportation of non-US citizens, so those holding a visa, including student visas, to be deported if they support terrorist organizations that undermine the United States security, including Hamas and Hezbollah. Now, why does this matter? Well, if you've been following us here on the Fearless Project since October 7th, you would have seen many of our conversations that we've had surrounding the college protest and encampments, which erupted almost immediately after October 7th, which endorsed Hamas actions as a legitimate form of resistance, and how the Palestinian question became a moral symbol for the larger social justice, the critical theory Marxist movement here in the United States, which calls for the dismantling of Judeo-Christian values and the founding principles of America. And something that many people objected to is that a lot of the students on these university campuses are non-US citizens. They're holding a student visa. And so while they have the privilege to study at some of the most prestigious institutions in the world, they're simultaneously and hypocritically taking to the streets or their university campuses to demand the dismantling of not just, the university and divesting from Israel, but of the United States at large. And so the new executive order will now empower the U.S. government to take action against those who call for the destruction of the United States, their universities, or for the violence against their fellow Jewish students in the name of solidarity with Hamas and Hezbollah, which has been a huge contributing factor to the wave of anti-Semitism across university campuses. Now, here at the Fearless Project, we have talked about this a lot. I've spoken with Daniel Sir, who is representing 5 Columbia students in a class action lawsuit against different actors on the Columbia University campus, including the chapter of Students for Justice in Palestine, its leaders, some faculty of Columbia, as well as U.S. Representatives AOC and Ilhan Omar. I've also spoken with Hussein Mansour to get to the ideological roots for the revolutionary radicalism of American universities and its neo-Marxist critical theory roots, which, champions both the Palestinian desire for statehood, but also Hamas as the answer to that, in addition to a myriad of other social justice issues, which we've seen sweep the nation since, before 2020, but it really became a cultural issue that has influenced politics here in the United States in 2020 and with the 2020 elections. We have seen the university or college campuses become a nexus for the cultural debate. And that's why this executive order is extremely important. So what is the executive order? On the 20th of January, President Trump signed many executive orders to put forth his immigration agenda for his second term. And this is actually part of that immigration reform. And so I will pull that executive order up. For those who are listening, I will link the executive order down below, or if you want to reference it, I will link it. The executive order is entitled Protecting the United States from Foreign Terrorists and Other National Security and Public Safety Threats. It is in section 2B that I'm most interested in. And it reads, to protect Americans, the United States must be vigilant during the visa insurance process to ensure that those aliens approved for admission into the United States do not intend to harm Americans or our national interest. More importantly, the United States must identify them before their admission or entry into the United States. And the United States must ensure that admitted aliens and aliens otherwise already present in the United States do not bear hostile attitudes, which we saw across university campuses, towards its citizens or its fellow peers, its students, culture, government, institutions, which includes university institutions and academic institutions, or founding principles, which again, part of that larger Marxist movement is calling for the dismantling of the United States as a colonial entity. It must be rebuilt. So again, that divesting from our founding principles was a huge issue in the movement swept across the United States since October 7th. It continues, and do not advocate for, aid, or support designated foreign terrorists, including Hamas or Hezbollah, or other threats to our national security. So essentially, if you are a student who is not a US citizen and you are going to take to your university campuses or any major city for a protest and endorse hostile attitudes towards other citizens, which again, we saw with the pro-Hamas Palestinian movement here in the United States since October 7th, it's not okay, according to this movement, for you to support Israel. You are then part of the problem. You are endorsing a colonial power, and therefore you also must divest or, be ostracized socially because of your sin, quote unquote, for supporting Israel. And so this is huge because what we saw happen across university campuses was a large swath of the ideological left, endorsing Hamas and trying to suppress support for Israel, intimidate those who support Israel, discriminate against those who are of Jewish heritage or identity. We saw that become commonplace, acceptable, viewed as a legitimate form of advocacy or quote unquote resistance. And university campuses, which are largely left-leaning, created the environment for this to be deemed acceptable. Columbia University, which peddles extremely left social justice, ideology, critical theory, Marxism, kind of created the beast, which then took over their university campus. And, universities have become the breeding ground for critical theory or neo-Marxist ideologies. But we saw these students, occupy and try and dictate how faculty address their Jewish students, address Israel, to divest from Israel. It was absolutely ridiculous. But university administrators, our last administration, the Biden-Harris administration, completely capitulated to these students. And why this is so important is because what happens on university campuses, or what is tolerated and accepted, especially during the last administration, had far-reaching implications. It didn't just live on these university campuses. It bled over into the cultural and political debate of, society at large here in the United States. It influenced policy and politics. The Biden-Harris administration, which was making a bid for a second term, was acutely aware of the fact that liberal students across American universities made up a huge portion of their voting bloc. And therefore, they politicized the war in Israel. They conditioned aid, and that had far-reaching implications on Israel's war in Gaza. So what happened across American universities actually was a huge security threat to America and to our greatest ally in the Middle East. And those ramifications are being felt today. That's why there's a huge sigh of relief for Israelis and people across the Middle East, even those who might not identify as right-leaning ideologically, that President Trump is in office, because we don't have a commander-in-chief who's going to capitulate to the radical demands of university students, because his political power doesn't hinge on getting their vote. And that's what we saw happen during the last administration. So this is huge. And I also want to play this clip from President Trump's first speech immediately after being sworn in, where he goes over his hard line against terrorism, against tolerating extremism, and creating peace through strength. But the part I want to highlight specifically is his comment on the hostages.
The proudest legacy will be that of a peacemaker and unifier. That's what I want to be, a peacemaker and a unifier. I'm pleased to say that as of yesterday, one day before I assumed office, the hostages in the Middle East are coming back home to their families.
So I think it's great that President Trump acknowledged the hostages, because it sets a tone from the highest office in American politics that we will not tolerate terrorism, terrorism abroad. Of course, there was American Israelis who were taken hostage, some of whom have not been returned home. We will not tolerate that, and we won't tolerate terrorism being accepted on university campuses. It's unacceptable. And if you are a foreign visa holder, that is grounds for deportation because it undermines our national security. And so this message coming from the top, I think, is going to create the cultural momentum we need to squash and silence the radicalism on university campuses. And again, I'm not an idealist. I realize that, left-leaning critical theory, Marxism has largely lived in academia on university campuses. That's really where a lot of the language we've even seen surrounding the Israel-Palestinian or the Israel-Gaza war over the last year and a half, such as oppressor oppressed, that paradigm, that's an academic concept, an idea, a Marxist idea, a framework through which to view social justice issues, economics, the world, colonialism, right? These are all vocabulary and words from academia. And so universities will continue to be a breeding ground for radical ideologies, but I don't think that these students are going to yield the power in which they were given by the last presidential administration. And I think there's going to be far-reaching consequences, which is great. Hopefully it changes the calculus many of these students have when they decide to take to their university, campuses to protest, even taking over parts of their university campuses to protest. That's not acceptable. That's not a legitimate form of advocacy or quote unquote resistance. It's not tolerated in the Middle East. It won't be tolerated with Hamas, and it most certainly won't be tolerated with our students here in the United States. Something else I want to point out, because I think it's worth noting, even though it's slightly off track, is that Biden and Harris are the last people to stand up for the standing ovation, welcoming those 3 girls home and celebrating their return to Israel. I'll play that again. At least they stood up. The Bushes didn't stand up. But again, the Bushes are responsible for creating a lot of unnecessary conflict in the Middle East. But Biden and Harris were the last to stand up. And I think it highlights that the issue of the hostages and politicizing Israel and their war aims against Hamas and Gaza were just collateral damage for the larger political and ideological aspirations for the Biden-Harris administration. And again, we have a strong commander-in-chief who has taken a hard line against terrorism abroad and domestic, which now also kind of expands that criteria to be students on university campuses who support Hamas or Hezbollah. And it won't be tolerated. And I think that's going to have, like I said, it's going to set the cultural precedent that will discourage, hopefully, what we saw over the last year and a half. We've already seen that, like I said, influence what's happening on university campuses. 2 days after that executive order, on the 22nd of this month, Columbia took action against a student, disciplinary action against a student who made a statement in an academic class on the history of modern Israel and was being disruptive. And so actions were taken to reprimand and then discourage, obviously making an example of this, future discriminatory or disruptive statements against Israel. So we're seeing Columbia now take a very, hard line against their students. They largely capitulated to the protesters in the spring of 2024. And so we see the cultural shift set by the precedent of the highest office with President Trump now influencing and trickling down to the disciplinary actions at the university level. So this is a great day. This is a win for free speech. This is a win for our Jewish neighbors and our Jewish students across America. And it's a win for our national security and therefore every American and their interest, because what happened across American universities is absolutely insane. As a reminder, there is sit-ins in Columbia's campus for almost an entire semester. Graduation was canceled, right? Even they had a graduation in the summer of 2024 that was largely used as a political statement, with many students walking across the stage in keffiyehs and holding their fists in the air in a Marxist sign of solidarity. It was crazy. And it was unfortunate because students who might not even really know about the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza were greatly affected by it. Their graduations were canceled. It was also the class of 2020, the senior high school class of 2020, who graduated in 2024 from college, also had their high school graduation canceled because of COVID. So you have an entire class of students who didn't get a high school or a college graduation. And unfortunately, we couldn't control COVID, but the insanity across many prestigious institutions in the United States in the spring of 2024 was largely manufactured because faculty capitulated and allowed for these students to not only protest in an inappropriate manner or call for the discriminatory action against their Jewish peers, but they took over entire buildings, such as on the Columbia's campus, which is absolutely insane. And that should never be tolerated. And like I said, this is a huge win. This executive order, I think, is going to set a huge precedent and discourage what we saw over the last year. So it's a good day. If you would like to learn more about what happened on these college campuses, I encourage you to check out some of our podcast episodes. I will link that in the description box down below. The Fearless Project has also done a lot of advocacy work against this. We went to Columbia and UCLA to stand in solidarity with not just Israel and their war against Hamas, but also with our Jewish neighbors and the students on these university campuses. And so this really hits home because we've done a lot of work against the hate that has happened. And hopefully this is a breath of hope and fresh air for the upcoming semesters across America. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you in the next one. Have a good day.